June 9, 1982, Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, 1:30 in the afternoon. Colonel Aviam Sella sat in the underground command center in Tel Aviv, watching radar screens that displayed the most sophisticated air battle coordination system ever deployed in combat. Through encrypted data links, he could see everything: Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries lighting up their radars, Israeli remotely piloted vehicles transmitting real-time video, fighter aircraft positioning for attack, and in Moscow, 900 miles to the northeast, Soviet military planners were about to witness something that would shake the foundations of their empire. What happened in the next 2 hours would destroy 30 Syrian missile batteries and 82 Soviet-built aircraft. It would shatter the illusion of Soviet military superiority that had sustained the Cold War balance of power for 3 decades. The numbers told a story that Soviet generals could not believe, would not accept, and ultimately could not ignore. 82-0, an entire air defense system dismantled in minutes, a technological gap so vast that it would force the Kremlin to question everything they thought they knew about their military capabilities. 9 years later, a Czech general would tell Israeli Air Force Commander David Ivry that Operation Mole Cricket 19 had been a catalyst for Glasnost and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The afternoon when Western technology proved its dominance so completely that it exposed fundamental weaknesses at the heart of the Soviet military-industrial complex. This is the story of how one battle in Lebanon changed the course of history and sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Moscow. The shadow of 1973 hung over every Israeli Air Force planning session in the years that followed the Yom Kippur War. On the afternoon of October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack that caught Israel completely unprepared. The Israeli Air Force, considered invincible after the Six-Day War, flew into a nightmare of Soviet surface-to-air missiles. In the first 3 days of fighting, the Israeli Air Force lost 50 aircraft out of approximately 1,220 sorties, a loss rate of 4%. In total, Israel would lose 109 aircraft in 18 days of combat. 98 of those aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft missile batteries. Only 4 fell in air-to-air combat. The Egyptian military deployed 20 mobile SA-6 SAM systems, backed up by 70 SA-2s, 65 SA-3s, and upward of 2,500 anti-aircraft batteries, plus about 3,000 SA-7s. Syria deployed another 34 SAM batteries. The SA-6 missile system, known to NATO as Gainful, proved devastatingly effective. Israeli F-4 Phantoms and A-4 Skyhawks, aircraft that had dominated Middle Eastern skies for years, fell in numbers that shocked the Israeli military establishment. Major General Ezer Weizman, former commander of the Israeli Air Force, coined a phrase that captured the despair. The missile bends the wing of the plane. Operation Model 5, a hastily executed attempt to take out Syrian SAM batteries near the Golan Heights early in the fighting, ended in catastrophic failure. The attacking force was decimated. Israeli pilots who had trained to fight other aircraft found themselves flying into walls of radar-guided missiles that gave them no chance to use their superior skills. The psychological impact on the Israeli Air Force was profound. Pilots who had considered themselves masters of the air now flew in fear. The losses were so severe that they spawned consequences far beyond the Middle East. The United States military, watching the Israeli experience, estimated that without a solution to the SAM problem, even American air power would suffer depletion within 2 weeks of conflict with the Soviet Union. The Israeli losses directly led to the creation of Project Have Blue, the stealth aircraft program that would eventually produce the F-117. But in Israel, the response was more immediate and more desperate. The Israeli Air Force needed a solution, and they needed it before the next war. In 1974, the task fell to Colonel Aviam Sela, an officer in the Israeli Air Force Operations Department. His mission was to develop a central command and control system that could coordinate air operations with unprecedented precision. The Israeli Air Force formulated a founding document to address the missile battery problem. The document outlined a multifunctional combat system that integrated observations and collection of target data, control and monitoring, weapons systems, intelligence gathering, communications networks, and training programs. Brigadier General David Ivry, then Deputy Commander of the Israeli Air Force, signed the document. Work teams were established. Development continued for 7 years. The Israelis studied every aspect of Soviet SAM systems. They analyzed radar frequencies, tracking methods, missile flight characteristics, reload times, crew procedures. They recruited electronic warfare experts. They developed new tactics. They built and tested equipment in conditions that simulated combat as closely as possible. The system they created was called Periscope. It integrated data from remotely piloted vehicles, airborne early warning aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and ground stations into a single, real-time picture of the battle space. From a command post in Tel Aviv, Israeli Air Force commanders could see the entire battlefield with a clarity that no military force had ever achieved. Every SAM battery location, every enemy aircraft taking off, every radar activation, every missile launch, all displayed on screens that updated in real time. The technological leap this represented was extraordinary. In 1973, Israeli pilots had flown into battle with limited information, relying on ground controllers who could only track a few targets at once. Communications were analog, prone to jamming, and limited in range. Intelligence about enemy positions was hours or days old. Pilots made decisions based on what they could see with their own eyes and information radioed to them by controllers who were often as blind as they were. The Periscope system changed everything. Data links transmitted information at speeds measured in MiGs. Computers processed radar returns from multiple sources simultaneously. Electronic warfare systems could identify and catalog every enemy radar emission. Remotely piloted vehicles provided video feeds that let commanders see the battlefield from multiple angles. All of this information flowed into a central command post where it was synthesized, analyzed, and distributed to pilots in real time. The Israeli Air Force acquired E-2C Hawkeye aircraft from the United States. These airborne early warning and control aircraft could track hundreds of targets simultaneously over a 300-kilometer radius. The Israelis integrated the Hawkeyes into their command system, creating a data link that fed information directly to the command post and to individual fighter aircraft. Israeli pilots, for the first time, could see enemy aircraft before they took off, track them through their entire flight, and receive targeting data that put them in optimal attack positions. Israeli engineers developed Mastiff and Scout remotely piloted vehicles. These drones could fly into enemy airspace, locate SAM batteries, and transmit their positions without risking pilots. More importantly, they could act as decoys, forcing Syrian radar operators to turn on their tracking systems and reveal their locations. The Israeli Air Force equipped its F-4 Phantoms with a GM-78 standard ARM anti-radiation missiles. These weapons could home in on radar emissions from dozens of miles away, striking SAM batteries before the crews even knew they were under attack. Electronic warfare pods were developed that could jam Syrian early warning radars and communications networks. Every F-16 and F-15 received upgraded avionics that allowed pilots to receive targeting data directly from the E-2C Hawkeyes. By 1981, the Israeli Air Force had created an integrated air combat system that was a decade ahead of anything else in the world. They had solved the problem that had devastated them in 1973. but they had not yet proven it in combat. That proof would come in Lebanon. Tensions between Israel and Syria over Lebanon had been escalating throughout the early 1980s. On April 28, 1981, Israeli F-16 fighters from 117 Squadron shot down 2 Syrian helicopters over Lebanon. Syria responded by deploying its first SAM brigades to the Bekaa Valley. Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who also served as defense minister, faced a dilemma. The Syrian deployment damaged Israeli deterrence credibility, but attacking might lead to an unnecessary clash with Syria and potentially draw in the Soviet Union. Begin decided on an attack scheduled for April 30th. Weather conditions forced cancellation. By the time weather cleared, the Israeli Air Force was preoccupied with preparations for Operation Opera, the strike on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. Meanwhile, the United States expressed concern that Soviet reaction to an Israeli strike might trigger a crisis between the superpowers. Washington pressured Begin not to attack. The Syrian missiles remained in place. Over the following months, Syria reinforced its positions in Lebanon. By June 1982, approximately 30 SAM batteries were deployed in the Bekaa Valley. The batteries consisted of SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 systems, the same missiles that had devastated Israeli aircraft in 1973. Syrian Air Force units were positioned to support the SAM network. Soviet advisors trained Syrian crews in the latest tactics. Moscow had supplied Syria with approximately 100 MiG-21 fighters, along with considerable numbers of MiG-23s and Sukhoi Su-20 ground attack aircraft. On June 6, 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, invading southern Lebanon. The stated objective was to push Palestinian Liberation Organization forces away from Israel's northern border. But Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon had broader ambitions. On the evening of June 8, Israeli ground forces clashed with Syrian units at Ain Zahalta. Sharon used this confrontation as justification for launching Mole Cricket 19. On the morning of June 9th, a cabinet meeting convened in Jerusalem. Sharon argued that Syrian armored forces, protected by SAM batteries, posed an immediate threat to Israeli ground troops. Without air superiority, Israeli forces could not operate effectively. The missiles had to be destroyed. Deputy Chief of Staff Amos Amir provided casualty estimates. When Prime Minister Begin asked about projected losses, Amir replied that he could not promise no losses whatsoever, but they would be minimal. Begin supported the attack. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Israeli Air Force Commander David Ivry received the order to strike. The Israeli aircraft took off in pairs from air bases across Israel. The first wave consisted of 96 aircraft. F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons would fly high cover, protecting the strike aircraft and engaging any Syrian fighters that rose to challenge them. F-4 Phantoms equipped with anti-radiation missiles would target the SAM batteries. Kafir fighters would provide additional strike capability. Behind them, a second wave of 92 aircraft prepared for launch. As the Israeli formations headed toward Lebanon, the Periscope system activated. E-2C Hawkeye aircraft orbited off the coast, their powerful radars sweeping the battle space. The Hawkeyes downlinked their radar picture to the command post in Tel Aviv and to a Boeing 707 electronic warfare aircraft that accompanied the strike force. Remotely piloted vehicles flew ahead of the strike force toward the Bekaa Valley. Syrian radar operators, watching their screens, saw multiple contacts approaching. The RPVs were designed to appear on radar like full-sized attack aircraft. Syrian air defense commanders, believing they were under attack, ordered SAM operators to activate tracking radars. This decision, though tactically sound according to Soviet doctrine, was exactly what Israeli planners had anticipated. The moment those radars came on, Israeli scout RPVs outside the missile engagement zone picked up the radar emissions. The scouts immediately relayed the signals to the E-2C Hawkeyes. Within seconds, the exact location of every Syrian SAM battery was displayed on screens in Tel Aviv and in the cockpits of Israeli F-4 Phantoms carrying anti-radiation missiles. The Israeli anti-radiation missiles were AGM-78 standards, weapons specifically designed to home in on radar emissions. These missiles had been developed by the United States Navy for use against shore-based radars, but they were equally effective against mobile SAM systems. The AGM-78 had a range of over 50 miles and could track radar emissions even if the enemy turned off their radars after launch. The missile would remember the last known location and continue to that point, destroying the radar installation even if it had gone silent. 20 Phantoms from Squadron 105 launched the first salvo. Each aircraft carried 2 AGM-78 missiles. 40 missiles streaked towards Syrian radar installations from ranges beyond the SAM engagement envelope. The Syrian crews never saw the aircraft that killed them. Missiles traveling at 3 times the speed of sound arrived without warning. Radar vans exploded. Fire control systems disintegrated. Communications vehicles were shredded by shrapnel. The carefully integrated Syrian air defense network began to collapse within minutes. Syrian SAM operators, trained according to Soviet doctrine, attempted to execute their defensive procedures. They tried to relocate their vehicles to alternate positions. They attempted to establish communications with backup command centers. They fired missiles at targets their degraded radars could barely track. But Israeli electronic warfare was disrupting every attempt to respond. Communications frequencies were jammed. Backup radars were targeted as soon as they activated. Syrian commanders found themselves unable to coordinate their defenses or even determine what was happening. Additional Phantom flights followed, launching more anti-radiation missiles. The Israeli strike aircraft remained outside the range of Syrian SAMs throughout the attack. Syrian missile operators, watching their radar screens go dark one by one, fired blindly. Missiles launched without proper guidance arced into empty sky. Not a single Israeli aircraft was hit. The Boeing 707 electronic warfare aircraft blanketed the area with jamming signals. Syrian early warning radars lost their ability to track incoming Israeli aircraft. Communications between SAM batteries and command posts were disrupted. Ground control intercept stations that normally directed Syrian fighters lost contact with their aircraft. The entire Syrian command and control network was effectively blinded. 20 minutes into the attack, 13 Syrian missile batteries had been destroyed. 6 more were damaged and unable to engage targets effectively. Syrian Air Force commanders, realizing their SAM network was collapsing, scrambled approximately 100 fighters. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and Su-20s roared off runways at Syrian air bases. But Israeli remotely piloted vehicles were already positioned over 3 major Syrian airfields. As Syrian aircraft took off, the RPVs transmitted the information to the E-2C Hawkeyes. The Hawkeyes, in turn, vectored Israeli F-15 and F-16 fighters into intercept positions. Syrian pilots, accustomed to receiving directions from ground controllers, heard only stats on their radios. Israeli electronic warfare systems jammed the frequencies used by Syrian ground control intercept stations. Without ground controllers to direct them, Syrian pilots were forced to rely on their own radar systems to locate Israeli aircraft. But their radar systems were inferior to Israeli equipment and were being actively jammed by Israeli electronic warfare aircraft. Syrian MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters had radar systems mounted in the nose and tail of the aircraft. They had no side-looking radar and no look-down, look-up capability. This meant that Syrian pilots could only detect targets directly in front of or behind their aircraft. Israeli pilots, flying aircraft equipped with more advanced radar systems, could detect Syrian aircraft from any angle. The Israeli E-2C controllers exploited this weakness mercilessly, positioning F-15 and F-16 fighters to attack Syrian aircraft from the side, where they had no radar warning. The AIM-7F Sparrow missiles carried by Israeli F-15s were radar-guided weapons with a range of 14 to 25 miles. These missiles could engage targets at Mach 3.5, far beyond visual range and outside the detection capability of Syrian radar. Syrian pilots, still trying to locate their Israeli adversaries, died without ever seeing their attackers. The Sparrows struck with devastating effectiveness. Israeli pilots fired their missiles, watched them guide to target on their radar displays, and confirmed kills before the Syrian pilots even knew they were under attack. At closer ranges, the engagement dynamics were equally one-sided. Israeli pilots employed AIM-9L Sidewinder infrared-guided missiles. The L-model Sidewinder represented a revolutionary advance in air-to-air missile technology. Unlike earlier versions that could only attack from behind, locking on to hot engine exhaust, the 9L had all-aspect capability. Its advanced seeker could detect the infrared signature of an aircraft from any angle, even head-on. This meant that Israeli pilots could engage Syrian aircraft in ways that were impossible with earlier missile technology. Syrian pilots who managed to evade Sparrow missiles in close to visual range found themselves facing sidewinders that could kill from any angle. Traditional evasive maneuvers, designed to defeat rear-aspect missiles, were useless against all-aspect weapons. Syrian pilots who turned away to present their tail to the attacker discovered that sidewinders could lock onto them from the front. Those who tried to close with Israeli aircraft head-on were destroyed by missiles that earlier technology could never have guided to target. Those who survived the missiles faced 20mm Vulcan cannons with computer-aimed fire control. The Syrian formation, already disorganized by electronic jamming, disintegrated under the Israeli onslaught. 15 pilots worked methodically through the Syrian fighters, each engagement lasting mere seconds. One Israeli F-16 pilot was credited with 7 kills in the battle, using a combination of Sparrows and Sidewinders. Syrian pilots, trying to break contact and return to base, were pursued and destroyed. The few who managed to escape did so only because Israeli controllers called off the chase, to avoid pushing too deep into Syrian airspace. By evening, when the fighting ended, the numbers told a story that military analysts would study for decades. 29 of 30 Syrian SAM batteries had been destroyed or rendered inoperative. By the time a ceasefire took effect at noon on June 10th, 82 Syrian aircraft had been destroyed. Not a single Israeli aircraft was lost to enemy action in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio was unprecedented in modern air warfare, 82-0. Even in the famous Marianas Turkey shoot during World War II, when American pilots decimated Japanese naval aviation, the ratio had been 6-1. Here, employing Western technology against Soviet equipment and Soviet-trained crews, Israeli pilots had achieved total dominance. The Israeli success derived from technological integration that the Soviet military had not anticipated. The combination of remotely piloted vehicles for reconnaissance and decoy operations, airborne early warning aircraft providing battle management, electronic warfare systems disrupting enemy communications and radar, precision-guided anti-radiation missiles engaging from beyond visual range, and fighter aircraft with superior avionics and weapons created a system that was more than the sum of its parts. Syrian crews, trained in Soviet doctrine that emphasized centralized control and rigid procedures, found themselves unable to adapt when that control was stripped away. Syrian Air Force pilots, accustomed to receiving constant direction from ground controllers, were helpless when Israeli jamming cut communications. Their aircraft, equipped with Soviet avionics that relied on ground-controlled intercept doctrine, lacked the autonomous systems that allowed Israeli pilots to operate independently. Syrian MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters were fast and maneuverable, but their radar systems, fire control computers, and weapons were a generation behind Israeli equipment. More fundamentally, Soviet training doctrine emphasized following orders rather than individual initiative. Syrian pilots flew set patterns, executed rehearsed maneuvers, and waited for ground controllers to direct them toward targets. When the communications network collapsed, they were unable to function effectively. Israeli pilots trained in Western doctrine that emphasized individual initiative and decentralized decision-making adapted instantly to changing tactical situations. The Soviet-built SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 missile systems were formidable weapons when employed properly, but they required integrated operation, with early warning radars providing target data to fire control radars that guided missiles to their targets. When Israeli anti-radiation missiles destroyed the early warning and fire control radars, the entire system collapsed. Syrian crews, trained to operate within a network, could not function when that network was shattered. The Israeli victory demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond the capabilities of Soviet-era systems and doctrine. The integration of space-based reconnaissance, airborne early warning, electronic warfare, precision-guided weapons, and network-centric operations represented a revolution in military affairs. The Soviet military, which had invested enormous resources in building a military machine designed to fight World War II-style campaigns, discovered that its entire approach was obsolete. In Moscow, the initial reaction was disbelief. Soviet military newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda announced that 67 Israeli aircraft, including modern United States-made F-15 and F-16 fighters, were downed in the fighting. The newspaper reported a meeting with a Syrian airman who recounted an engagement in which he shot down an Israeli F-15. The victory had not been easy, the pilot claimed. The enemy had been subtle. Even within Soviet military ranks, these claims met with great skepticism. Too many Soviet advisors had been in the Bekaa Valley. Too many had witnessed the actual battle. On June 9th, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad dispatched Defense Minister Mustafa Tlass to Moscow seeking a comprehensive air umbrella over Syria. The Soviets refused but prepared large amounts of military equipment at airfields for dispatch. More significantly, Moscow sent Marshal Pavel Kutakov to Syria to investigate what had happened to the Syrian SAMs. Kutakov was Commander-in-Chief of Soviet Air Forces, holder of 2 Hero of the Soviet Union awards, a decorated World War II fighter ace. His presence indicated how seriously Moscow took the disaster. Kutakov arrived in Damascus with a team of technical experts. They interviewed Syrian crews. They examined wreckage. They reviewed every available piece of evidence. What they found deeply disturbed them. Syrian crews had not been incompetent. They had followed their training. They had executed Soviet doctrine. And they had been annihilated anyway. The problem was not Syrian performance. The problem was that Western technology had rendered Soviet systems obsolete. Marshal Kutakov filed classified reports to the Soviet Defense Ministry that painted a devastating picture. The Americans and their Israeli allies had developed capabilities that Soviet intelligence had not fully appreciated. Remotely piloted vehicles that could locate SAM batteries without risking aircraft. Electronic warfare systems that could blind radar networks across entire battle spaces. Airborne warning and control systems that provided real-time command and control. Precision-guided weapons that could strike from beyond the range of Soviet air defenses. Fighter aircraft with avionics and weapons that gave Western pilots decisive advantages in beyond visual range combat. More troubling than the specific technologies was the integration. The Israelis had created a system where every element reinforced the others. Remotely piloted vehicles located targets. Electronic warfare aircraft suppressed radar and communications. Airborne warning and control systems coordinated the entire battle. Strike aircraft destroyed targets. Fighter aircraft protected the strike formations. Every piece of the system was linked through data networks that provided real-time information flow. Soviet doctrine, based on centralized control through ground stations, had no answer. The implications went far beyond Syria. If NATO forces in Europe employed similar systems and tactics, the entire Soviet war plan was in jeopardy. Soviet military strategy for war in Europe assumed that massed air defenses would prevent NATO from achieving air superiority. Soviet ground forces, protected by mobile SAM systems, would advance westward faster than NATO could respond. But if NATO possessed the capability to destroy those SAM networks as easily as Israel had destroyed Syrian air defenses, Soviet armored formations would be exposed to devastating air attack. Soviet generals who had spent careers planning for war in Europe suddenly faced the realization that their plans were built on assumptions that were no longer valid. The technological gap between Soviet and Western systems was not narrowing, it was widening. And the gap was most severe precisely in the areas where Soviet military doctrine claimed superiority: air defense and integrated command and control. Fear gripped the Soviet military establishment. If NATO commanders were watching the same battle footage that Soviet analysts were studying, they would realize that Soviet air defenses could be defeated. The entire Soviet deterrent in Europe rested on the assumption that NATO would not risk war because the cost would be too high. But if Soviet SAM networks could be destroyed with minimal losses, that calculation changed dramatically. Marshal Kutakov's reports circulated through the highest levels of Soviet military and political leadership. The General Staff reviewed them. The Defense Ministry studied them. The Politburo was briefed. The conclusion was inescapable. The Soviet Union was falling behind in the technological competition with the West, and the gap was growing. Soviet military industries had achieved impressive quantitative production. They built thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of armored vehicles, thousands of aircraft. But quantity was not compensating for qualitative deficiencies. Soviet avionics lagged Western standards by at least 10 years. Soviet radar technology could not match Western capabilities. Soviet computers were primitive compared to American systems. Soviet electronic components were less reliable and less capable. These deficiencies existed because the entire Soviet economic system was structured to prevent innovation. Central planning stifled creativity. Military industries focused on meeting production quotas rather than developing improved systems. Quality control was inconsistent. Research and development programs were chronically underfunded despite massive overall military budgets. The best Soviet scientists and engineers were diverted into nuclear weapons programs, leaving conventional military systems with second-tier talent. More fundamentally, the Soviet system could not generate the kind of innovation that emerged from Western free market competition. American defense contractors competed against each other for contracts, driving innovation. Israeli military industries, operating in a capitalist framework, developed creative solutions to tactical problems. The Soviet system, with its centralized control and bureaucratic rigidity, could not match this dynamism. Soviet leadership gradually came to understand that technological competition with the West was not sustainable. The Soviet economy simply could not generate enough wealth to fund the kind of research and development required to close the gap. Every ruble spent on trying to match Western military capabilities was a ruble not spent on maintaining Soviet living standards. The Soviet Union was already allocating 20 to 25% of gross domestic product to military spending. compared to 5 to 6% in the United States. Yet Soviet military technology continued to fall further behind. The realization that the Cold War was unwinnable began to take root in Soviet thinking. Operation Mole Cricket 19 was not the only factor, but it was a critical one. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Soviet military technology and doctrine were inadequate, and it did so in a context where the implications could not be ignored. If Israel, a small country with limited resources, could achieve such dominance using Western technology, what could NATO accomplish in a general war? In 1991, 9 years after Mole Cricket 19, Major General David Ivry, former Israeli Air Force commander, visited Czechoslovakia. A Czech general who had served as a military attaché in Moscow in 1982 told Ivry that the operation had been a catalyst for glasnost. The blow to Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries made the Soviets understand that Western technology was superior. This realization raised fundamental doubts about Soviet capabilities throughout the defense sector. In the Czech general's view, Mole Cricket 19 featured prominently in the series of events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, initiated glasnost and perestroika partly because he understood that the Soviet Union could not win a technological competition with the West. The military-industrial complex was consuming resources the Soviet economy could not sustain. Attempting to match Western military capabilities would bankrupt the country. The only rational course was to seek accommodation with the West, reduce military spending, and restructure the Soviet economy. The path from Operation Mole Cricket 19 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not direct. Many factors contributed to the Soviet collapse: economic stagnation, political rigidity, ethnic tensions, the Afghanistan War, the Chernobyl disaster, and the fundamental contradictions of communist ideology all played roles. But the technological shock delivered by Operation Mole Cricket 19 crystallized Soviet understanding that military competition with the West was futile. 1 year after the battle, Lieutenant General John Chain, United States Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Plans and Operations, led a fact-finding mission to Israel. American military analysts studied every aspect of Operation Mole Cricket 19. The lessons learned influenced American doctrine for decades. The integration of remotely piloted vehicles, electronic warfare, and precision weapons became standard in American military planning. The Gulf War in 1991, where American forces destroyed Iraqi air defenses with similar tactics, vindicated the approach pioneered by Israel in Lebanon. NATO military planners, who had spent years worrying about Soviet SAM networks defending approaches to Eastern Europe, gained confidence that those defenses could be defeated. The psychological impact was significant. NATO had assumed that any war in Europe would be long and costly. Operation Mole Cricket 19 suggested that Western technological advantages might allow for rapid, decisive operations with acceptable casualties. Soviet military planners reached the opposite conclusion. They understood that in any future conflict, they would face enemies with overwhelming technological superiority. Soviet air defenses, the cornerstone of their defensive strategy, could be systematically destroyed. Soviet aircraft would be decimated by enemy fighters equipped with superior avionics and weapons. Soviet ground forces would be exposed to air attack against which they had no adequate defense. The realization that the Cold War was unwinnable began to take root in Soviet thinking. Operation Mole Cricket 19 was not the only factor in this shift, but it was critical. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Soviet equipment and tactics had fallen behind, and it did so in a context where the implications could not be hidden or ignored. In 1991, 9 years after Mole Cricket 19, Major General David Ivry, former Israeli Air Force commander, visited Czechoslovakia. A Czech general who had served as a military attaché in Moscow in 1982 told Ivry that the operation had been a catalyst for glasnost. The blow to Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries made the Soviets understand that Western technology was superior. This realization raised fundamental doubts about Soviet capabilities throughout the defense sector. In the Czech general's view, Mole Cricket 19 featured prominently in the series of events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, initiated glasnost and perestroika partly because he understood that the Soviet Union could not sustain the military competition with the West. The military-industrial complex was consuming resources the Soviet economy could not provide. Attempting to match Western military capabilities would bankrupt the country. The only rational course was to seek accommodation with the West, reduce military spending, and restructure the Soviet economy. The path from Operation Mole Cricket 19 to Soviet dissolution involved many factors: economic stagnation, political rigidity, ethnic tensions, the Afghanistan War, the Chernobyl disaster, and contradictions within communist ideology all contributed. But the technological shock delivered by Operation Mole Cricket 19 crystallized Soviet understanding that military competition with the West could not be won. 1 year after the battle, Lieutenant General John Chain, United States Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Plans and Operations, led a fact-finding mission to Israel. American military analysts studied every aspect of Operation Mole Cricket 19. The lessons learned influenced American doctrine for decades. The integration of remotely piloted vehicles, electronic warfare, and precision weapons became standard in American military planning. The Gulf War in 1991, where American forces destroyed Iraqi air defenses with similar tactics, vindicated the approach pioneered by Israel in Lebanon. NATO military planners, who had spent years concerned about Soviet SAM networks defending approaches to Eastern Europe, gained confidence that those defenses could be defeated. NATO had assumed that any war in Europe would be long and costly. Operation Mole Cricket 19 suggested that Western technological advantages might allow for rapid, decisive operations with acceptable casualties. Soviet military planners reached the opposite conclusion. They understood that in any future conflict, they would face enemies with overwhelming technological advantages. Soviet air defenses, the cornerstone of their defensive strategy, could be systematically destroyed. Soviet aircraft would be decimated by enemy fighters equipped with superior avionics and weapons. Soviet ground forces would be exposed to air attack against which they had inadequate defense. For decades, Soviet military doctrine had assumed that quantitative superiority would compensate for qualitative deficiencies. Soviet generals believed that massed forces in superior numbers would overcome Western technological advantages. Operation Mole Cricket 19 demolished that assumption. Quality had defeated quantity decisively. The battle also exposed vulnerabilities in Soviet doctrine itself. Centralized command and control, rigid procedures, and emphasis on following orders left Syrian forces unable to adapt when their system was disrupted. Western doctrine, emphasizing decentralized decision-making and individual initiative, proved far more effective in the chaos of modern combat. Soviet military academies began studying Operation Mole Cricket 19 intensively. Soviet equipment was inferior. Soviet doctrine was outdated. Soviet training methods produced operators who could not adapt to unexpected situations. But revising these approaches would require resources the Soviet economy could not provide and cultural changes the Soviet political system could not accommodate. The fundamental problem was that the Soviet system was structured to maintain political control rather than maximize military effectiveness. Communist Party oversight ensured military decisions supported political objectives, but it also stifled innovation and prevented honest assessment of failures. Admitting that Soviet systems were behind the West was politically dangerous. Officers who reported technological deficiencies risked their careers. This institutional dishonesty created a feedback loop where Soviet military capabilities declined, while official assessments claimed improvement. By the time Operation Mole Cricket 19 exposed the truth, the gap had grown so wide that closing it was impossible without fundamental economic and political reform. The 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed in a single afternoon represented more than tactical losses. Each destroyed MiG symbolized the failure of Soviet military industry. Each demolished SAM battery demonstrated obsolescence in Soviet air defense doctrine. The complete inability of Soviet-trained and Soviet-equipped forces to inflict any losses on their adversaries proved that Soviet approaches to military power were fundamentally flawed. Moscow's immediate response revealed the depth of Soviet dysfunction. Rather than honestly assessing what had happened, Soviet propaganda claimed victory. Krasnaya Zvezda reported that Israeli aircraft had been shot down in large numbers. Syrian pilots were praised for their courage and skill. The truth, which Soviet military professionals understood perfectly well, could not be publicly acknowledged because doing so would undermine the entire myth of Soviet military superiority upon which Soviet global influence depended. But within the closed circles of Soviet military leadership, the truth could not be hidden. Too many advisors had witnessed the battle. Too many technical experts had examined the evidence. Too many intelligence analysts had reviewed the data. The Soviet military knew it had been decisively defeated by proxy. This knowledge influenced Soviet military planning for the remainder of the 1980s. Soviet generals became increasingly cautious about military confrontation with NATO. They understood that in any direct conflict, Soviet losses would be catastrophic. The illusion of Soviet military equality with the West had been shattered. Operation Mole Cricket 19 demonstrated that modern warfare was entering a new era. The revolution in military affairs, driven by advances in computers, sensors, communications, and precision weapons, was creating capabilities that rendered earlier approaches obsolete. The Soviet Union, with its centralized economic planning and rigid political control, could not adapt to this new reality. The West, with its free market competition and decentralized innovation, was pulling ahead at an accelerating rate. The battle revealed the importance of integrated systems over individual platforms. Syrian pilots flying Soviet aircraft were not inferior as individuals, but they were part of a system that could not function when its communications and coordination networks were disrupted. Israeli pilots operating within a system that integrated information from multiple sources and provided them with superior situational awareness achieved dominance because they were part of a better system. This insight had profound implications. The age of the individual warrior was passing. Modern warfare was becoming a contest between systems. The military force that could better integrate sensors, communications, weapons, and decision-making would dominate the battlefield regardless of individual courage or skill. The Soviet military, built on traditions of individual heroism and mass mobilization, was structurally unsuited for this new kind of warfare. As news of the Israeli victory spread through military circles worldwide, assessments of Soviet military power underwent fundamental revision. Western military planners who had assumed rough parity between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces began to question that assumption. The technological advantages that Israel had exploited in Lebanon were available to all NATO forces. The pressure for increased defense spending decreased. Confidence in Western military capabilities increased. The psychological balance of the Cold War shifted. In the Middle East, the immediate impact was equally significant. Syrian military power, which had been a major factor in regional politics, was revealed as inadequate against Israeli forces. Israeli air superiority over Syrian forces was now unquestioned. Syrian President Assad, who had positioned himself as a champion of Arab resistance to Israel, found his military credibility damaged. The Soviet Union, which had armed and trained Syrian forces, saw its regional influence diminish. When the United States military went to war against Iraq in 1991, the operational plan echoed Operation Mole Cricket 19. The first night of Operation Desert Storm saw American forces systematically destroying Iraqi air defenses using tactics pioneered by Israel 9 years earlier. Remotely piloted vehicles and cruise missiles struck radar installations. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed communications. Stealth aircraft delivered precision weapons. Fighter aircraft achieved complete air superiority. The Iraqi military, equipped and trained by the Soviet Union, was as helpless as Syrian forces had been in Lebanon. The Gulf War confirmed what Operation Mole Cricket 19 had suggested. Soviet military systems and doctrine could not survive contact with Western technology and tactics. The Soviet military, watching Iraqi forces destroyed with minimal American casualties, understood that the same fate awaited them in any conflict with NATO. This knowledge influenced Soviet decisions during the final years of the Cold War. Operation Mole Cricket 19 stands as one of the most significant air battles in history, not because of the number of aircraft involved or the strategic importance of the objectives, but because of what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare and the technological competition between East and West. In 2 hours of combat over the Bekaa Valley, Israeli forces demonstrated that the revolution in military affairs was real, that technological superiority could produce overwhelming tactical dominance, and that assumptions about Soviet military power needed fundamental reassessment. The 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed that afternoon marked the beginning of a new understanding. The 29 SAM batteries demolished in minutes symbolized the obsolescence of Soviet air defense approaches. The 0 Israeli losses to enemy action demonstrated the magnitude of Western technological superiority. These numbers could not be explained away or hidden. They demanded acknowledgement that the balance of power was shifting. In Moscow, Soviet military and political leaders faced uncomfortable truths. The military-industrial complex they had built at enormous cost was producing systems inferior to Western equivalents. The doctrine they had developed was unsuited for modern warfare. The training methods they employed created operators who could not adapt to unexpected situations. Making necessary revisions would require resources and systemic changes that the Soviet economy and political system could not provide. 9 years after 82 MiGs fell in one afternoon, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The empire that had challenged the West for global dominance, that had terrified NATO commanders with visions of massed armies, that had built the world's largest military machine, simply ceased to exist. Among the causes of that collapse was the gradual realization, crystallized by Operation Mole Cricket 19, that the Soviet Union could not win the technological competition with the West, and that continuing to try would destroy the country. The afternoon of June 9, 1982, began with Soviet confidence in their air defense systems and military doctrine. It ended with that confidence shattered, beyond repair. The future of warfare belonged to those who could integrate advanced technology into coherent systems. The Soviet Union, with its centralized planning and rigid ideology, could not compete in that future. The numbers haunted Soviet planners. 82-0, 29 batteries destroyed, 0 effective response. Complete, total, undeniable defeat. These were not numbers that could be hidden in classified reports or explained away in propaganda. These were numbers that demanded recognition of uncomfortable realities. The Soviet generals who studied Operation Mole Cricket 19 understood something that Soviet politicians would take years to accept. The military competition with the West could not be won, not through direct military confrontation, but through technological superiority so decisive that confrontation was pointless. The revolution in military affairs had rendered Soviet military approaches inadequate. This understanding, spreading through Soviet military and political leadership in the years after 1982, created the intellectual foundation for glasnost and perestroika. If the Soviet Union could not compete militarily with the West, then confrontation was futile. Accommodation was the only rational strategy. The Czech general who told David Ivry that Operation Mole Cricket 19 was a catalyst for glasnost and Soviet collapse spoke truth. The blow to Syrian SAMs in Lebanon on June 9, 1982, sent shock waves through the Soviet military establishment that reverberated for years. Those shock waves contributed to the recognition that the Soviet Union could not continue on its existing path, that fundamental reform was necessary, and that accommodation with the West was inevitable. The afternoon when 82 MiGs fell and 29 missile batteries were destroyed was the afternoon when illusions died. The illusion of Soviet military equality. The illusion that central planning could match free market innovation. The illusion that ideology could triumph over technology. In 2 hours over the Bekaa Valley, those illusions were destroyed as completely as the Syrian air defenses. The Soviet Union would survive 7 more years, but the decisive blow had been struck.